समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Welcome to the World View with Swasti. I'm very pleased to welcome Marc Saxer, who's director at the FES Asia, and he's a well-known geopolitical commentator, author, and expert. I think for many years, Marc, now you've been looking at the changing global order, and a lot of times, I think through your work, you've explored this global uncertainty. And today, you're in New Delhi with this brand new book of yours, which is called Geopolitical Conflict in the Wolf World. I think a metaphor that we would like to understand better, because while we have talked about decline of the global order, we have talked about decline of Pax Americana, we have talked about the rise of Pax Seneca and the global contestation, global power contestation. But I think the wolf world is something which I'm hearing for the first time. So I look forward to asking you more about this. And also, I would love to hear about you from all your research that you've done for many, many years in South Asia, in East Asia, and so on. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this brand new book that we are discussing in New Delhi for the first time?
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be back. The Wolf World is basically a quote by Thomas Hobbes, who described the world in his time, which was the 17th century, where there was basically a civil war in England.
Yeah.
He famously used a quote, which is much older, that said that in a world where there is no law, there is no rule of law, there's only the law of the jungle. A man is another man's wolf, right? So the wolf world actually allures to that, taking a start in the analysis that we have witnessed the end of Pax Americana. And so there's obviously a lot of names for the order that we had. Some people in the West like it, the liberal or the rule-based international order. I know that people here in the region are not so fond of this kind of label. But what we see, what we observe is that for the last couple of years, last 2-3 years, we see an escalation, almost an explosion of conflict around the world. We have the most interwar and also civil wars in the world since World War II. So whatever it was that came to an end, something came to an end, and we're entering a much more unstable and uncertain time.
Right.
And this uncertain time where might makes right, this is what I call the wolf world. And the book tries to explore, what it means, how we can navigate it, and maybe how we can stabilize it.
Now, Marc, that's interesting because, that metaphor I think is very befitting, without a doubt. And it's interesting because you, obviously, you start out as a European and you talk about how there is a decline of the liberal order, and Europe was pretty much the seat of, the place where the liberal order was put together, at least ideologically, and then the manner in which it was exported to other countries, and then it was America that became the torchbearer of it. Also for the benefit of a lot of younger researchers and students, while they all the time hear decline of the liberal order, sometimes they don't know what a liberal order really is, right? Is it just got to do with American foreign policy, or are there other values that also underpin what we call the liberal order, before we discuss that, the fact that it is in decline? So in short, right, how do we best explain what really is the liberal order?
I think maybe the best way to imagine liberal order is with 3 pillars, right? One of them is ideological. It's liberal mission to promote democracy and human rights. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, called this to make the world safe for democracy, right? And then there is an economic pillar, a liberal economic order, an open world market. And finally, there is this multilateral architecture, United Nations, the World Bank, and so on, which is providing some sort of international governance and platforms or cooperation. 2 things about this order. Number one, is it truly European? I would put a question mark.
Okay.
The European order has always been Westphalian. right? The European order has emerged from a situation also from the 17th century, where you had 30 years of war, religious wars, where no victor emerged. So basically, the takeaway of the Europeans is that if there's no victor, if there's no side that can impose rules and their regime and their values on all the others, the only way that you can manage and navigate in this world to be agnostic. Right. So the Westphalian Order is about sovereignty and non-interference and territorial integrity, which means you do whatever you want in your country, and I do whatever I want in my country. So we do not have additional reasons for conflict.
Okay.
I would argue that the liberal world order basically was an attempt by the Americans, first with Woodrow Wilson after World War One. Then the second attempt was after World War II, 1945, the creation of the United Nations. But then the Cold War happened, and then really came into being as a fully fledged functional order for only 30 years after the end of the Cold War. So I think it is more of an American order that is collapsing, and that's also why it's collapsing, because there is a relative decline of the US.
Right, and this relative decline of the US doesn't mean that US is no longer the most powerful nation on earth. I mean, there is, and towards the end of your book, you sort of grapple with that idea that whatever we have today with respect to how the so-called order is breaking down, there is still an indispensability attached to the United States, and yet you see that this is fundamentally altering the contours in which we see conflict or cooperation emerging in three distinct theaters you talk about. Why don't you tell the viewers about these three distinct theaters, and then we go into each?
Well, first of all, I completely agree. The United States today in 2026 is still the most powerful nation on earth. It is militarily, technologically, economically, financially, culturally, and ideologically the most powerful state on the planet. I think where the shift has occurred is that this state used to have a such dominant position for the last 30 years that you can almost call it an empire. And I think what happened in the last 30 years, or let's say the last 15 to 20 years, is that the United States became structurally overstretched. And there's three dimensions why this happened. Number one, the United States used to have, until last year, a doctrine, a defense doctrine, that claimed that they need to be in a position to fight 2 or maybe 3 wars simultaneously and win them, right? But now you're in a situation, as you already mentioned, there are 3 primary theaters of contestation. US hegemony is challenged by Russia and Europe, challenged by Iran in the Middle East, challenged by China in East Asia. And that means the US is no longer in a position to deal with these challenges simultaneously. Right? Second, the US is running up to 39 trillion American trillion dollars of debt. So there is a question mark over its fiscal sustainability. It's the health of its financial markets. And finally, you have a revolt, not only MAGA, but actually going across the political spectrum against what people call the forever wars. So that means there are limitations to US power, which are structural. And that means that whatever period that we have lived through in the last 30 years is now coming to an end.
Right. And here you also mentioned that, the US itself has been seen sort of recalibrating its stance towards China. Right. And what makes matters more complicated is this, this trade war, the tech disruption, the protectionism, etc. Let's just talk a little bit about this as well, because what happens is that, when we are talking about all these variables at the same time, one doesn't know how to really place them in the bigger picture. There is a relative decline of the US, I totally agree, and that is also sort of having an impact on what we are seeing in the world today. But then where does come, and I see in the book that you've written, a couple of chapters on this. How do you then look at the tech factor, the geoeconomic, disruption of the supply chains, etc., because that sort of complicates it many folds.
Well, obviously, there is this very famous quote by the ancient philosopher Thucydides, who believes that if there is a rising power and a declining hegemon, there is a very high likelihood of war. And of course, we are today in a situation like this, and Xi Jinping actually quoted that when Donald Trump visited China. There is a high likelihood, it's exactly that kind of situation. So if we're all lucky, and I think there is reason to be optimistic that there will not be a military showdown between 2 nuclear-armed superpowers to determine who's number 1, right? That means that the hegemonic geopolitical competition between the United States and China moves onto the arena of economics and tech. Right? So geoeconomics is the playing field where the geopolitical struggle is being fought out. And that's actually what you see if you look in the newspaper every day. So the United States is trying to postpone China's catch up to the technological frontier. So you have export controls for semiconductors and chips. You have investment controls. You have, of course, tariffs, the tariff war that Trump declared. You have discussions about decoupling and diversification. You have small yards and high fences. So there's lots of strategies that the U.S. tried to deal with this competitor that they have, and China is hitting back with export controls on rare earth and critical minerals and so on. It has a huge industrial base, and has a very successful industrial policy. And you may or may not say that we are in a situation right now where they have reached an impasse. Right? It seems that no side seems to be able to decisively overwhelm the other side. So that means we're going to be in a situation where those two have to somehow deal with each other, and that will be interesting to see how that happens.
Right. So these two are having to deal with each other, and that is also sort of shaping in many ways, the behavior of how the other powers around them are sort of functioning. Because in your book, you argue that this particular US as the US's indispensability and China as a peer superpower is basically then putting in place a bipolar Europe, a bipolar East Asia, but a multipolar Middle East. Let's start with the multipolar Middle East, because that's a war that has been going on for a while, and then we don't know how far this is going to go. Why do you say a multipolar Middle East?
Maybe one step we're missing before we come to that is structurally, I said the US is overstretched, so it can no longer obtain the kind of primacy it had. But now we have to enter the Trump 2.0 administration, and Trump 2.0 actually declared the liberal world order that the United States founded and guaranteed for 80 years obsolete. So what Trump has been doing is he's attacked the liberal mission. USOID, democracy promotion, human rights is also basically all
their
put to
national
rest.
security strategy, their defense strategy, everything alludes to it.
Tariff war is a direct assault on an open global market, return of protectionism, and of course the US defunding United Nations organizations, retreating from the COP and all sorts of. So basically, liberal hegemon has declared the liberal order obsolete, and it also is seriously questioning the alliances of the US. And that's a huge headache for its allies in Asia, its allies in Europe, and its allies in the Middle East. What makes the Middle East so interesting, and that's why you're right to ask that question first, is that the Middle Eastern allies are the first ones to really have to have an answer, because there is a hot conflict there going on, right? And I think if you look closely, what is happening is that all the hedging and balancing that the allies are doing in the Middle East is a very interesting case in point for a post-American regional order. You do have some allies, like the United Arab Emirates, who are coalescing towards Israel and towards closer cooperation with the US. You also have some other American allies, like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, who are looking the other way, basically trying to hedge against Iran and Israel at the same time, trying to have replacement security guarantors like Egypt or Pakistan, right? So basically, every time is trying to find a new footing in this order where you cannot rely on the traditional security guarantor anymore.
Right, and that sort of leads to a sort of a multipolar order in the Middle East. Then you talk about a bipolar East Asia. We are closer to this theater. I would also like to come to South Asia, but then let's start with this. So how do you think these dynamics play out?
So now we talk about East Asia, and as you already allured, I think South Asia is a bit distinct from that. So we're looking at the situation where there is a bipolar situation between China on the one hand and the US and its allies on the other hand. This is the main theater.
Right.
It's the primary theater, so to say. It is the only theater where I believe the stakes are so high that there is a probability that you actually may cross the nuclear threshold. This is where the two tectonic plates, a Chinese-led sphere and an American sphere actually are meeting in the South China Sea as well,
The Taiwan
around
Straits.
Taiwan, right? This is where the US for the last 80 years has constructed military bases alongside the first and second island chains, right?
Yeah.
And this is actually where there's another famous strait, right? We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz a lot, but there's a Strait of Malacca, right? So this is also where you can actually cut off the supply chains of China, which is where China has been trying to break out what they perceive as encirclement, right, towards the West, the European market, the energy supplies of the Middle East. That's the Belt and Road Initiative, if you look through it from a geopolitical angle. And all the fortifications and militarizations of the South China Sea and all the island hopping that you see in the Pacific, that is basically the approach of China to break out of this, what they perceive as encirclement. And if you flip the script and you look at the same thing, classical security dilemma, with the eyes of the American allies, it is the first aggressive military peer since Pearl Harbor that pushes into Pacific.
Right. Now, while I agree that this is how it looks at a systemic level, but if I fine tune and if I sort of argue in let's say in context or in reference to what is happening in the last 2-3 years, I think, don't you think that Xi Jinping's reading of not entering into a military conflict is also pretty sound, and is also would have a lot of evidence, because what we saw in Ukraine, now Russia is stuck there for the last 5 years. We saw that America, despite its military superiority, is alongside Israel. That's known to have, military prowess, which is, quite intimidating, to say the least. And yet they were not able to get to a strategic outcome in the Iran war. That's not because the IRGC was militarily more powerful, but they had a certain leverage and they played that leverage. I would argue they're also overplaying that leverage. However, the fact that military wars today will not be able to lead you to a strategic outcome that you desire, and perhaps would bleed you more. In your reading of China, how much appetite do you think somebody like Xi Jinping would have for something like that?
Well, I think there's been war games obviously going on both sides, in Beijing as well as in Washington. I think the strategic planners on both sides have come to the conclusion that a military showdown over Taiwan would come at a very, very high price, probably unacceptable price if you take into account what I said, that there is a probability of crossing the nuclear threshold. So that's why already in the Biden administration, you saw a certain climbing down from the tree, right? From a very, let's say, rhetoric of confrontation. Think about the peak when Nancy Pelosi right,
visited Taiwan.
went to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And I think it cooled down a bit. And I think the Trump 2.0 administration has been continuing this cooling down. And that has to do with the fact that there may be no military solution. So if you look at what China is doing beyond the rhetoric, then you can see two things. Number one, the US has been pulling out. Think about the three theaters and the trade-offs between the theaters, zero-sum games. So the US is busy in the Middle East, so it's pulling out parts of its naval assets of the South China Sea. It's pulling out part of its missile installations from the Korean Peninsula, and it's pulling out paratroopers from Japan. Right. So you may argue the door is wide open. Right. And what does China do? It's beheading its military commission. So if China wanted to be ready, the opportunity is better than it's been in a long time.
Right. And I think that the another factor that makes it a little bit unpredictable is, again, this lack of rationality that we have been seeing. I mean, there are several events that have happened that everybody argued against, and yet they happened. One of the things being Trump deploying American troops alongside Israel in a war in the Middle East that no other American president has done in the history of America, even though the Jewish lobby has been so strong and so on. So I just like to hear a little bit from you on this, this unpredictability factor. It seems as if, I think, a lot of world leaders and a lot of these global forces could be operating outside the realm of rationality. I mean, what is the best way to understand that?
Well, I mean, there are certain explanatory power if you look at Trump's personality, obviously. I think that's a factor. But I think maybe more interesting to explore is that there is a power struggle in Washington over the role of the US in this emerging multipolar world. There are different schools of thought, and they are basically battling this out. To cut a long story short, you have the premises on one hand, who actually want to use the still significant US power to retain primacy, including going to war. That is obviously the faction that pushed forwards Venezuela and the war in Iran.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have the restrainers, which may or may not be further ideologically aligned with the MAGA movement, who basically say that these imperial wars have devastated the American working and middle class, and that you actually should use all these resources in order to rebuild the American homeland. Obviously, restrainers in government are also much more hawkish than this, right? So there is obviously, even within the restrainers, a strong emphasis on the Western Hemisphere and so on. But basically, these are the two schools of thought that are battling it out. And I think some of that erratic back and forth that you see coming from Washington is that these two power factions have still not decided who's top dog.
Right. Okay. And now let's come to Europe. And you say that even Europe is going to be bipolar. When you say that, what exactly do you mean? Do you think this is if I read it right, this is to do with a part which is dominated by Russia and the other which is dominated by Brussels or NATO? What exactly is this?
Well, Europe has always been bipolar in the
Okay.
sense that there's Russia and there is whatever you call the West, or you call NATO, right? So obviously there's a confrontation. It's playing out in a hot war in Ukraine right now. The interesting question that you're alluring to is obviously what's going to happen if the US retreats, steps back, maybe even sometimes cooperates with Russia. I mean, you can argue that right now Europe finds itself in a pincer movement between Trump America and Putin Russia, right? So that obviously complicates this. I would argue that it's still bipolar. And I mean, if you looked at what NATO has discussed in Turkey, is that there are structural interests. For instance, the Americans still need their bases in Europe, but they still need the market access and all of that. So it's not that easy to retreat from this kind of alliance. But obviously, there have been significant challenges for the Europeans. Greenland was a breaking point. The Iran war, where they have not been consulted, rather been insulted, actually, was a breaking point. And that obviously, very similar question that we discussed already in the Middle East, the questions that every European statesman right now has to grapple with is how do we deal with a situation where we're highly vulnerable, but we also know we can no longer rely on the security guarantor that we had for the last 80 years. How do you play your cards in such a situation?
Right. This is how it looks when you're looking at three primary theaters, Mark. But another thing that, and in fact, I mentioned it earlier, but then now we can sort of elaborate on it a little bit. You also go into the details of how the same power distribution is going to look, or this global, contestation between these two big powers is going to look in different sectors. And you start with the energy sector, the tech sector, the military sector, etc. You say the energy sector is going to be multipolar, okay, with respect to what is happening. So is this got to do with I think, in my own opinion, this has got to do with the fact that more and more countries are realizing that dependence on singular choke points is going to be always a problem. It is always going to be a vulnerability. So the best is to try and diversify to the best, in the best way possible. That's my reading. But what do you mean when you say that there will be a multipolar energy sector?
Well, basically, so far we've been discussing about things that we can already see, and now we're putting up the crystal ball and trying to look into the future what the global distribution of power is going to be, right? And of course, this is among scholars and pundits. We're always talking about bipolarity and multipolarity, and I think you really have to dive in a little bit, right? You already mentioned that the different regions look differently. You have a multipolar Middle East, you have a bipolar Asia and East Asia and Europe. And if you look into the sectoral things, finance, military, technology, as well as energy, is also different. I would argue that militarily, usually the US used to be the strongest military power. There's now some competition regionally from China. But the same kind of dominance the US did not have since the 1970s in the energy sector, right? Of course, OPEC are to a large part American allies. Saudi Arabia is an American ally. But you also see that at the fringes, from Iran to Venezuela to Russia and Iraq at some point, they were breaking apart, the OPEC alliance. The UAE just quit OPEC, others may follow, right? So that means in a situation where power used to be relatively concentrated in some sort of a cartel, you're going into a more multipolar situation. And that, I think, is an interesting observation because it's not moving towards bipolarity, right? I think that's why we need to look into the sectors.
I think this is also important, Mark. I don't know if you'd agree, but this has also got to do with the fact that now we're looking at more sources of energy. I mean, now it's very clear that you cannot really only be talking about hydrocarbons. And for example, in India itself, the push for nuclear energy, the push for going back to burning up coal for the India has been sitting on the largest coal reserves, and if we can properly utilize them, this is going to last us for 300 years. But because we did not have the technology to really extract, the right calorific value that we are now developing. But the point that I want to emphasize on that this probably has also got to do with the different forms of energy that countries are now pursuing. I mean, China is also making a huge push towards renewable. China is making a huge push towards small modular reactors, etc. So, do you think this multipolarity that is visible in the energy sector per se is got to do not only with the actors but also the resources and now the technology that is available to exploit those resources?
Yes, absolutely. And I think if there's one lesson learned that everybody on the planet learned from the Third Persian Gulf War is that how high your vulnerability are if you are dependent on one source of energy from one region of the world. That is a squeeze that I promise you every policymaker in the entire world is thinking at night how to get out of this, right? And obviously, as you said, the answer to that is diversification of the energy sources. I mean, you're going to have to go renewable and nuclear and fossil at the same time. You're also going to diversify your suppliers, right? Which is interesting. We used to have this kind of conversation about value-based partners, like-minded partners. Now everyone is trying to just have a reliable supply chain, right? So this is changing things.
Right. And it's also for India, it's interesting because all this changing energy map is also sort of putting back certain suppliers for us that had been taken away from us because of US sanctions. And the case here being obviously Venezuela, that has just Venezuelan oil has made a comeback, apart, of course, from Russian oil that we've been purchasing in huge quantities. So point well taken. Now, interesting you mentioned that, and point well taken there. And then you also talk about the tech sector and you talk about the military sector. And, you talk about how there is a bifurcation, how there are certain countries which we push to take sides, etc. I get that. When it comes to the financial sector, you say this is going to be largely unipolar. So could you sort of elaborate a bit on this?
Used to be largely unipolar because the depth of the American financial market, which is somewhat connected to the UK and London, right, is by far the deepest. You have, of course, the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. And you see in a crisis like this, despite all the warning signs that come from Washington, there is still the function of the US dollar functioning as a safe haven for nervous investors, right? So this is a thing that in 2027 is still intact to a large degree, but it is also highly contested, certainly. And it is contested from several sides. Number one, you see that, let's take the BRICS. India is part of the BRICS. There's a certain frustration over the weaponization of the US dollar by the US when you think about sanction regimes. And there have been some efforts to use different currencies, local currencies, for trading with each other. There are some efforts to create replacements for payment systems like SWIFT and so on. I would argue that this all does not yet amount to a replacement of the dollar.
Or de-dollarization.
De-dollarization is, of course, the buzzword here. But, and I think that's very interesting, the US itself is undermining the position of the dollar.
And how is the US doing that?
Well, number one, with this increasingly unsustainable debt,
Okay.
if you look at the nervousness over US treasuries, if you look at that central banks are shifting out of US treasuries towards gold in a dramatic and rapid fashion,
Okay.
then that shows that there are now question marks. I mean, the US basically lost its AAA rating, which never happened, right, for the issue of the global lead currency. So that is one thing, and then also basically this kind of over reliance on financial sanctions will backfire at
Will
some point.
backfire. Yeah, correct. The problem is that, and I would like to hear your views on that, because you do mention BRICS and these other groupings. And of course, India is a part of BRICS, and so many other countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all are parts of BRICS. But the problem, to my mind, is when you look at a grouping like BRICS, the problem is that they do not really have either an economic coherence or a strategic coherence, or, for example, a military coherence or whatever. I mean, whatever you mean by the word coherence, except for the fact that they would like to sort of reduce the uncertainty linked with this, with the behavior of the United States and whatever's going on in the world, and they would like to hedge their bets. Apart from that one commonality, you see that there is no other commonality, and then BRICS becomes, everybody is doing their own thing. However, there has been some success because they have a new development bank, they get into loans, and I think that is a mechanism which the developing world really looks forward to. But in terms of the strategic dissonance and in terms of the economic dissonance, I mean, how can India sort of do anything to support de-dollarization if it is leading to yuanization, right? And how do you see this particular problem being resolved or being managed as we go ahead? Because I agree that the US debt is unsustainable, and yet you have a situation where you don't have anybody or any other currency really filling in. And even if you were to do that, this is a related question, I just want to throw in this element so that we don't miss it, that most of these currencies remain pegged to the dollar. So what kind of a fiscal world then, or a financial world then, we are sort of entering?
Well, you're asking a very interesting question. I would 100% agree that things like the BRICS, but many other of these minilateral groupings are driven by concerns of vulnerabilities, hedging, and balancing. And I think you can argue that they're quite successful when it comes to that. Does that translate into order making?
Yeah.
Right? So the old order is dying, right? But who's going to make the new order? Who's going to write the new rules? Does the BRICS have the kind of policy coherence, the ideological coherence in order to make a new financial system? And I think you know that the answer is no, right? Which then begs the question, so if the old order is continuing to decay, are we going into disorder? Right, which is again the wolf, right? So the question that is coming up and on the horizon, I think that's one of the questions that the book is asking: what if there is no rule maker? What if in all of this mess there is no victor? Right? How do we arrive towards at least stabilization? I'm not even saying a new order with new institutions. That is something that in this particular situation I think is too far-fetched. But given what I said in the beginning, how conflicts are escalating everywhere, and I mean we're talking about at least a possibility of great power wars. I'm not saying it's happening, but that hasn't been on the agenda for decades, right? So it is a very dangerous situation. I think there is a high need to start stabilizing this, and that's actually where I'm looking into.
Okay. I would definitely bring you back to the theater that we have, which is South Asia, because you do mention that even South Asia became a theater of conflict. Perhaps you were alluding to the India-Pakistan conflict of 88 hours. I'll come to that. But you do mention, towards the end of your book, and you do mention that, okay, there is a problem. And one of the reasons why I really liked reading it, and not just this one, but your previous book, which was Transformative Realism, where you sort of argue that the kind of thing, it's not just realism, but that realism has to be transformative, and you make a good case. Why I like reading this book is that you don't only mention that there is a problem with the liberal order, there is a decline. I think this is the most oft-quoted phrase that we have come across in recent strategic discussions, but you try to find a way out, and you say that we have to navigate it. I think the point that you were alluding to earlier. How are we going to navigate the wolf world?
Well, short term, long term, right?
Yes.
Short term, obviously, if you look at the countries, hedging, balancing, cutting vulnerabilities, building resilience, trying minilateral formats of corporations, partnerships in the middle power coalitions. So everyone's trying to find their footing.
Okay.
And so I think this is just like trying to get by, trying to not get hurt in a dangerous situation. The long term is obviously a very interesting question,
Yes.
because if we have, for the first time in history, we're talking about the history of the world. There's never been a global order that didn't have a victor that is actually imposing its order. It's the first time in history that Western and non-Western powers somehow have to figure out how they want to live together, what kind of rules they can all agree on. Never
Okay.
happened before, right?
Okay.
And that I think needs we need to have a deep dive into concepts of order in different civilizations.
Right.
Let's say the civilization that has grown around China, the civilization that has prospered for thousands of years in South Asia, let's say the Islamic civilization, maybe also the Russian Orthodox civilization, have different historical experiences and philosophical traditions, which means that number one, they have different traditions of concepts of order.
Right.
Right? What is a good order and what is considered a dangerous situation? And of course, there are also in modern times, in 2026, as we speak, hot debates within these civilizations and their leading powers, what kind of order they want.
Okay, can I just hold you there and also sort of, just request you to sort of delve a little bit deeper on this? How is this thesis then different from, let's say, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which is that, you're inherently different kind of worldviews, different kind of philosophical traditions, and eventually you're going to clash. How is what you're proposing here sort of different from there? Because that's a familiar argument. So I think for the benefit of the viewers, it becomes easier if you were to sort of, then mention that, okay, this is where it differs or this is where it doesn't differ. Of course, it's up to you to sort of elaborate. Yeah.
Huntington is talking about culture and identity. I'm talking about geopolitics and geoeconomics.
Okay.
That's number one.
Okay.
Huntington has a weird kind of determinism in there. There's almost somehow built into history that these civilizations inevitably have to get into conflict. My argument is precise opposite.
Okay.
I say that looking at the concept of order and trying to figure out what the commonalities are actually one of the ways out of the impasse and the disorder that we actually have right now. So I'm not making a civilizational argument and say, okay, you are different from me and that's why we're going to have a conflict. What I'm saying is, I cannot dominate you, you cannot dominate me. Is there a common ground that we both can agree on, that these are the rules that we can actually maybe live under?
Right. Okay. Now, you did mention, when you were mentioning the short term, of course, you did mention the Middle Power Coalition. And I have to talk a little bit about this because in the last few weeks, or let's say last 2 months, I think whatever number of conferences I have attended, I have spoken at all over the world, they somehow had to do with the Middle Power Coalition. I think Mark Carney made it very fashionable. The idea has always been around from the 70s, 80s. However, Mark Carney sort of at Davos this year in January made it really fashionable, and then now everybody is talking about that. Let's just understand there is a certain vagueness around Middle Power Coalition as well, because not all countries that are not US or China are middle powers. I mean, India doesn't look upon itself as a middle power. In your opinion, quickly, we all agree that yes, middle power, there's no one definition that fits everybody. And yet, how do you make sort of, how do you build strategic coherence in this entire discussion? Yes, agreed that most of, these smaller countries or middle power countries would like to come together to try and hedge their bets. But I'm just repeating the same semantics, isn't it? So how do we build a strategic coherence in this middle power obsession that we seem to have today, at least after 2026?
Well, first of all, why is this conversation so fashionable at the moment? It has to do with exactly that situation that I described earlier. The US and China have come to an impasse.
Yeah.
They are deeply mistrustful of each other. They may have to find a way how to live and coexist, but at that particular moment, there is a high contestation of multilateral institutions, and there is a paralysis of international cooperation. But climate change is still happening, and migration is still happening, and pandemics are still there, and there is a need to regulate AI at some point. So we need to make some headway also in international cooperation at the very moment when everything is paralyzed. Hence, as you said, this is an old discussion, but it's very fashionable right now. We say, okay, if the two big ones cannot cooperate, maybe the ones in the middle can cooperate. I very much appreciate what Carney was saying in Davos. I would make a couple of points where I think the conversation would be more useful.
Okay.
First of all, as you already said, there are no middle powers in the world. There's a lot of powers who believe they're bigger than the middle power, and there's a lot of powers that are smaller that want to be middle powers.
Yeah.
Is a completely fruitless discussion. We're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
I call this partnerships in the middle,
Yeah.
and it obviously needs smaller powers. There are, if we do this in more a issue-based, flexible geometry, there's a lot of topics where, you know, maybe one smaller countries bring some expertise and a unique vantage point to the conversation that is actually needed. So the idea to exclude the smaller countries is a mistake to begin with.
Right.
Carney also is like lingering underneath. There's still the value stuff, and I think we have to be agnostic now, right?
Okay.
This is not middle power democracies. We actually need to have cooperation between a much broader spectrum of ideological domestic regimes.
Right.
Domestic regimes, in my point of view, should not be a criteria at all, right?
Okay.
And finally, don't call it coalition.
Okay.
Don't call it alliance.
Yeah.
Right? Call it partnership.
Partnerships.
Because in Asia, no one wants to take sides.
Right. Yes. And that was the point that I would really wanted to come to, towards the end, that in our part of the world, we definitely see, there's this push and pull, of course. There is this, inherent restraint in countries to not take sides, and yet there are sort of, things like the tech sector, the AI, which is so dominated by the two global powers that willy nilly you will have to take sides, because these two models are pretty mutually exclusive. And still, I think the push is that nobody wants to take sides. So, in our part of the world, where do you see the power distribution and the capability distribution affecting our part of the world? India, Pakistan, so on. Maybe you can go a little bit towards Southeast Asia, towards the region that are closer to us, Bangladesh. Yes.
There's a famous quote. I think it was a former prime minister of Singapore. I'm not sure, but it says, "No one wants to take sides except if structural forces force us to take sides against our best interest." So I would say the majority of powers all over the world, but in particular here in Asia, do not want to choose sides. They want to retain their room for maneuver. They want to retain their strategic autonomy, and they actually want to enlarge this room for maneuver, right? However, as you allured, there are structural trends that can be forcing you and pressuring you to take sides. Tech, I think, is number one.
Yeah, tech.
If you look at the magnitude and scope of investments into AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, this is not something that smaller countries can actually put up with, right? Yeah. So if there is a tendency of bifurcation, which means that there's going to be a Chinese-led and there's going to be an American-led tech world that is no longer compatible. That means smaller countries increasingly have either very, very high opportunity costs, or they have to choose one tech. You're already familiar with that when it comes to military equipment. You either have this weapon system or you have another weapon systems. And when it comes to maintenance, when it comes to procurement, when it comes to ammunitions, you're somehow stuck in one system, right? So this may replicate in tech. It may actually at some point replicate in finance. And these are like the little trends that are somehow pressuring you into one camp. All of the smaller countries and middle powers trying to resist that trend. Yeah. But the question is, at the end of the day, can you?
Right. And I think to that, my reading is that I think when we talk about the middle powers or the countries that are basically not US and China and the countries outside of that, that power contestation, I think what they would what would make sense, and I think you'd agree, is that they have to find their convergence around specific issues. If the conversation is not happening around specific issues, then the conversation actually goes nowhere, because we keep sort of getting back in the same
Right.
circles. And with that, I have to thank you, Marc. This was Marc Saxer, Director, FES Asia. FES stands for Frederick Ebert Stiftung, a very well-known political foundation from Germany. And this is his latest book, for which he's having the first ever discussion in India. So I would like to thank you once again, and I would urge you all to read this book whenever you can.
Thank you very much.